What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work To Game, and it is time for a three-part series on how to pick your class. Now this is going to start with a very generalized overview, and then we're going to dive in on a couple of categories in future videos so you can watch them in any order that makes sense to you, but I'm going to try to start at the most basic and branch out. So let's assume for a moment that this is your first MMO. You've been away from an MMO a long time. Maybe you've played RPG games, role-playing games where you kind of follow a character through a progression. Maybe you haven't, and maybe you come from other MMOs where maybe you've played things like Final Fantasy XIV, maybe you played EverQuest back in the day, Guild Wars, things like that. But basically, the first thing you need to know is that in any MMORPG today, roles typically fall within one of three categories. There's a handful of games out there that have a fourth called support. If you're thinking of that one is not here. So those three categories are tank, healer, and DPS. There is two breakdowns within DPS, but we'll get there. Let's start with tank. What is your job? Your job is to take the hits from everything coming at you. So why would you want to do that? Because you're going to go into battle with big armor, lots of life, lots of shield, lots of some way that you can survive big hits so that people behind you don't have to bring that level of survivability and can instead focus on their jobs. A tank is one of the most critical roles to a party. There are very few tanks in most forms of content across all games of this style, and usually it's one of the most in-demand jobs there is because it does feel like a lot of pressure. If a tank doesn't do their job, everybody dies. Now, a tank can also have the benefits of faster queue times. I've found in my personal experience, every time I tank, I really have to know the content a lot better. And so there's just a lot of advantages there. But the disadvantages are that it can be a little bit of extra pressure. Now, how do they get everything mad at them, you might ask? Well, this is called different things in different games, and these games have been around long enough that a lot of the terms are used in all the games. Primarily, it's going to be called threat here, but threat, aggravation, also sometimes called aggro, enmity, hate, basically is a gauge, an objective measure of how mad at you is the monster. If, for example, a DPS's level of hate with the monster were to rise above yours, then that monster might shift focus to them. And so your goal is to generate that and by various actions. And so not necessarily focusing first and foremost on damage, but first and foremost on making sure that everything in the room that can be facing you is facing you. And then making sure that you are moving around the level as needed to make sure that any attacks that they toss out there, like a line drive, face away from the party instead of towards. You generally set the pace within content, and so that is really what tanking is about. The next most important role is the guy who keeps you alive. That is your healer. And not necessarily one is more important than the other, but that's the other extremely important, always in demand job. And healers are exactly what they sound like. They're just healing any damage that goes out. Most of that is on the tank, but occasionally there will be something like maybe a bunch of rocks fall from the ceiling and everybody takes damage no matter what. They're going to have to go ahead and heal that. They might resurrect players that have fallen, to battle. And so a healer's job is pretty straightforward. It can be really fun and really aggressive to heal in like PvP. It can also feel like a pressured job. If you don't, it's pass fail. Everybody lived or everybody didn't. Now there are terms for performance within healing, things like overhealing and stuff like that. There are reasons against that. Why would you not want to overheal? Well, first of all, overheal means that you tossed a heal out and the player that the heal hit, their life is already full. So you healed for extra. And so the reason you don't want to do that is it burns up your mana, the pool of resources you use to cost more healing. And so you might run out of that in the future. So it's more about forward thinking, but it also generates a lot of excess hate and things like that because healers oftentimes can on many encounters run in that very second slot. So if the tank isn't doing their job, there's a lot of times that guy's going to go ahead and grab the healer. And if the healer dies, usually a lot of healers are wearing things that don't necessarily focus on survivability because they're focused on power of healing, then the healer is not built for tanking. They go down pretty quick. The whole party wipes. The third and final role is the most popular role in all MMOs. WoW is far from excluded. by far. Now, most of WoW's content centers on 5-man dungeons or 10 or more man raids. And so you're looking at 1 or 2 tanks, a handful of healers, 1 in dungeons, a handful in raids, and everybody else falls into the DPS category. DPS stands for damage per second. These are your damage dealers. These are the guys who kill it so that the mob doesn't take forever. This is the lowest pressure job because if they don't do their job, the encounter just takes longer until you start to get into high-end content. As you start to get into in-game content and stuff, there are concepts like where a monster, if a certain amount of damage is not done in a certain amount of time, it can wipe the raid, but you share that pressure across all these other people, and so it's very easy to say, well, they did it. And so typically there's a lot of damage dealers, and damage dealers are incredibly fun to play in the open world. They do a ton of damage. Now, WoW has made huge strides in making sure that healers and tanks can go out in the open world and quest reasonably. But damage dealers have always been able to do it. Damage dealers, it's fun. You see big numbers, you slam things, and the skill gap is not as much pass-fail. So there's a lot more room for kind of beginner level damage dealers down at the bottom that can work their way up and really squeak out more and more damage out of the same exact character with the same exact gear than somebody who maybe hasn't quite mastered that class yet. Damage dealers fall into the 2 categories of melee and ranged. Your ranged is going to be your casters, your guys with bows, things like that, and your melee is going to be guys with swords and guys with maces, and you know, they're up front, right? And so, you know, like a druid is just a cat form, just going crazy, as opposed to their balance spec is where they're what's called a moonkin, and they're casting down beams of like solar energy and stuff. So you just kind of have to choose the preference there. Do you want to be basically up with the tank in the action, but not right in front of the boss where you get hit with him? Or do you want to be back with kind of the healers typically, where you're just trying to avoid things that are on the floor that don't need to be stood in? And so there's just a preference there. A lot of parties like a mix of both. There are definitely good reasons for that. And so that is where this is going to fall. So really this first video is just an introduction to what is your role. What task do you want to do in this game? And it's incredibly important to the next 2 videos as we dive in. So just think about that, think about the task you want to do, and just know that within many classes, they have what's called specializations, specs, and they get to jump between those specs. You know, there's some optimal gearing long term, but for the most part, you have all those specs available without having to level a new character. And many of these classes have specs that go across these roles. And so if more than one of these roles jumps out to you, or you wish you could do one of these roles a little bit, you know, you wish you could do a couple different kinds of damage or a couple different kinds of healing, there are definitely classes that might fit for you. Thank you guys so much for watching. Sorry there's no gameplay. This one is just a beginner introduction to the game. What role are you in a party? If you have any questions, comments, things like that down there below, I would love to carry the conversation on. Just know there's 2 more parts to this series. I'm releasing them rapid fire so that anybody who starts one can immediately jump into the next one and the next one and the next one, so that we can get a feel for, you know, exactly what class in World of Warcraft would be the most fun for you to level up as your first character, or as your main, or as an alt, or whatever is causing you to question, hey, which class should I play by next time that I log into World of Warcraft? My name is Chris with Work To Game. Thank you guys so much for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.